There is a particular kind of darkness that belongs only to Old English inns, not the darkness of a moonless sky or the darkness of a shuttered room, but something older than both, something that has settled into the timber and the stone over centuries, the way cold settles into bones. It is the darkness of things that happened and were never spoken of again, of guests who arrived in the night and never left in the morning, of secrets folded into the walls and left there to breathe. England's oldest inns have always been crossroads, places where lives collided for a few hours before scattering again into the fog. Merchants and murderers, priests and pirates, lovers running from one life toward another. And in some of these places, something of those collisions remained. Not memory exactly, not quite a ghost in the way that word is commonly understood. Something harder to name. A presence, an echo, a persistence. This is a story about 3 of those places. 3 inns where the past did not stay past, where the dead, it seems, chose not to leave. Begin then with London, with the grandest address on Portland Place, with a building that opened its doors in 1865 as the first grand hotel in all of Europe, a monument to Victorian ambition and excess, fitted with electric lights and hydraulic lifts at a time when such things were barely imaginable. The Langham Hotel was built to impress the world, and it did. Oscar Wilde drank here. Mark Twain slept here. Napoleon III, exiled from France and stripped of his empire, lived out his final years in these corridors. Princess Diana walked these floors. The guest list reads like a registry of Victorian civilization at its most glittering. But there is another registry, one that the hotel does not advertise in its brochures. A register of those who arrived and never truly departed. The 3rd floor is where it begins, more specifically, room 333. If you were to walk that corridor tonight, the long carpeted hallway of the Langham's 3rd floor, lit by the soft amber glow of wall sconces, you might notice something that is difficult to articulate, a quality to the silence that feels less like quiet and more like held breath. The air a degree colder than it should be. The sensation, faint but unmistakable, that someone is standing just behind you. The story attached to room 333 is one that the hotel's oldest staff will tell you in low voices if you ask at the right moment in the right hour of the evening. It concerns a Victorian doctor, silver-haired, distinguished, a man of considerable reputation in the medical world of the 1860s. He arrived at the Langham with his new wife on the night of their wedding. They were shown to the finest room on the 3rd floor, room 333, which in those days was considered among the most desirable in the hotel. A fire was lit, champagne was brought, the door was closed. By the following morning, both of them were dead. What happened in those hours between midnight and dawn has never been fully established. The doctor killed his wife. The accounts agree on that much. The method, the motive, the precise sequence of events, these dissolved into the silence of the Victorian age, which was skilled at burying its ugliest truths beneath layers of propriety and discretion. What is known is that the doctor took his own life afterward. The room was sealed, the matter was hushed, and that, the hotel perhaps hoped, would be the end of it. It was not the end of it. The first confirmed encounter with whatever remained in room 333 came in October of 1973, more than a century after the tragedy. The BBC, which had purchased the Langham after the war and converted portions of it into accommodation for its journalists, housed a broadcaster named James Alexander Gordon in that room on a night in the deepest part of autumn. Gordon was not a superstitious man. He was a radio journalist, a man of facts and deadlines, not given to flights of imagination. He had stayed in hundreds of hotel rooms across his career. He was not expecting anything unusual when he turned out the light and settled into the bed. He woke at some point in the depths of the night to a light in the room, not the light of a lamp or a street lamp beyond the window, but a light that had no source, a fluorescent ball of luminescence hovering in the darkness above the floor. Gordon lay still, watching it, his journalist's mind trying to find the rational explanation. Then the ball began to change shape, to elongate, to take on the rough dimensions of a human form, the shoulders, the torso, the head. It was wearing Victorian evening dress, a cravat, a long coat. Its eyes, if eyes is the right word for what was visible in that pale luminescent face, were open and entirely empty. the blankness of them somehow worse than any expression of rage or grief. The figure had no legs below the knee. It hovered above the carpet, the stumps of its shins disappearing into nothing, and it began to move. It opened its arms, a gesture that might have been welcome or might have been something else entirely, and it drifted toward the bed. Toward Gordon, who was by now neither lying still nor thinking clearly. He scrambled out of the bed, threw open the door, and fled down the corridor in the direction of his colleague's room. He brought the colleague back, and the figure was still there, fading by that point, slowly dissolving back into the darkness from which it had come, but present long enough for two men to see it, two professionals who had no motive to invent such a thing, and every professional reason to keep quiet about it, which, in the end, they did not. The story spread. The room acquired its reputation. In the years that followed, the reports accumulated with a persistence that is difficult to dismiss. Guests thrown from their beds by something they could not see, with such force that they fled the hotel without collecting their belongings. The cold that descends on the room at certain hours of the night, the temperature dropping suddenly and without explanation, the sensation of being watched from a corner where nothing is visible. A woman who stayed in the room in 2014 woke to see a figure in a top hat standing at the foot of her bed, motionless, watching her with those same empty eyes. And then there is October. The figure in room 333 appears, by all accounts, almost exclusively in October, as if the month itself is somehow connected to the original crime, as if the doctor and his bride arrived at the Langham in some October long past, and that specific seasonal darkness has retained something of them ever since. The hotel, for its part, no longer routinely rents room 333. You can ask to stay there if you choose. Some people do. Not many stay until morning. But the doctor is not the only guest who never checked out of the Langham. There is a German prince, identity unknown, who is said to have thrown himself from a fourth-floor window in the years before the First World War. His ghost, beefy, close-cropped, wearing a military jacket buttoned to the throat, is reported to be the most active of the Langham's supernatural inhabitants. He walks through walls. He appears in the early hours of the morning, moving through sealed doors, as if the architecture of the building is simply an inconvenience to him. He has been reported in room 333 as well, as if that particular room is some kind of crossing point, some location where the membrane between what is and what was grows thin. There is a butler still attending to his duties on the third floor, dressed in livery that no living member of staff has worn for a century, wandering the corridor with the purposeful unhurry of a man who believes he still has work to do. There is a man with a gaping wound across his face who keeps to the hallways, never entering the rooms, as if condemned to pace forever between destinations. And in the basement, in the furthest and least visited reaches of the hotel's lower floors, Napoleon III is said to remain, the fallen emperor, the exile, the man who lost everything and retreated to the Langham, as if a luxury hotel on Portland Place might be an adequate substitute for an empire. What draws them to this place is not a question that can be answered with certainty. Perhaps it is the building itself, its walls having absorbed so much living and dying over a century and a half. Perhaps it is something about the specific geometry of the third floor, the particular angle of that long corridor. Room 333 positioned at its midpoint like the still center of something spinning. Perhaps, and this is the explanation that sits heaviest in the mind at 2 in the morning when the hotel is quiet, perhaps some places simply refuse to let go of their dead, and the dead, finding themselves held, eventually stop trying to leave. But the Langham is a city hotel, a grand address on a famous street, visible and visited and lit with modern light. The darkness there is the darkness of specific rooms, specific hours, specific months of the year. There are places in England where the darkness is older and deeper and less confined to particular corridors. Places like Rye. The town of Rye sits in East Sussex, on a hill above the surrounding marsh, a medieval citadel that the sea abandoned centuries ago. It was once a port, one of the Cinque ports that supplied ships to the English crown, and its streets still carry the logic of a place built to serve sailors, steep and narrow and cobbled, winding in on themselves in ways that suggest concealment, that suggest the movement of goods that were not supposed to be moved, The town has never quite lost that quality. Even now, even in the bright light of afternoon, there is something about Rye that suggests secrets. The Mermaid Inn sits on Mermaid Street, which is everything you imagine when you imagine a medieval English street. Cobblestones black with age, the buildings leaning toward each other overhead as if sharing whispered confidences, the light even at noon having a quality of perpetual dusk. The inn has been here, in one form or another, since 1156. Its cellars, the oldest part of the building, have sat beneath this hill for nearly 900 years. The current structure, the black and white timber frame, the dark oak beams, the carved stone chimney pieces, dates from 1420, though additions were made across the following centuries, each era adding its own layer to the accumulated strangeness of the place. To walk into the Mermaid Inn is to step out of linear time. The floors slope, the ceilings are low, the staircases multiply unexpectedly, leading to unexpected landings, connecting rooms in ways that do not follow any modern logic of architecture. There are secret passages. There are hidden tunnels running beneath the building, extending out under Mermaid Street in both directions. One of these tunnels, bricked up for centuries, leads to another inn on a parallel street, a route used by men who could not afford to be seen arriving and departing through the main door. Those men were the Hawkhurst gang. In the 1730s and 1740s, the Hawkhurst gang was the most feared criminal organization in southeastern England. They were smugglers, 600 strong at their peak, controlling territory from Kent to Dorset with a combination of commercial acumen and casual, almost theatrical brutality. They ran brandy and silk and tea across the Channel, evading the revenue men with a brazenness that had less to do with stealth than with the simple fact that no magistrate in the region dared interfere with them. Contemporary witnesses recalled seeing the Hawkhurst men seated at the windows of the Mermaid, carousing, smoking their pipes, their loaded pistols on the table before them, as the citizens of Rye went about their business outside with careful, eyes-forward haste. The inn was their territory, the tunnels were their infrastructure, the secret passages within the building itself, the revolving cupboard in the Old Bell Inn that served as an exit point, the hidden staircase between the bar and what is now called Dr. Syn's bedchamber, the trapdoor in the floor of the Elizabethan room that leads down to a space with no formal name, but which can reasonably be described as a dungeon. These were the mechanisms of their empire, built into the fabric of the building as carefully as the chimney pieces and the oak beams. The Hawkhurst gang ended, as criminal empires tend to end, in execution. Their leaders, Arthur Gray and Thomas Kingsmill, were hanged in 1748 and 1749, respectively. The organization fractured, the men scattered or were taken. The tunnels fell silent, but silence at the Mermaid Inn has never lasted long. The Elizabethan bedchamber, room 16. In the current numbering, a room that contains a secret passage, an oubliette, and a worn stone staircase that descends to what is now the bar, has been the site of one of the most consistently reported hauntings in England. The events that occur here are not random, as supernatural events are popularly imagined to be. They follow a pattern. They follow, in fact, the same pattern, reported by guests across decades who had no knowledge of each other's experiences. Two men fighting, men in period dress. Some witnesses say doublets and hose, placing them in the 16th century. Others describe the clothing as cruder and more practical, consistent with the 18th century and the Hawkhurst era. They fight violently with blades, the sounds of the conflict preceding the visual manifestation, the huffing of breath, the clash of steel, the scuffle of feet on stone. The fight moves through the room. It reaches its conclusion. The loser is seized and dragged to the oubliette, the trapdoor in the corner of the room, and thrown down. Then silence. In December of 1993, two guests, neither of whom had any knowledge of the room's reputation, neither of whom were seeking anything other than a comfortable stay at a country inn, were asleep in the Elizabethan bedchamber when they woke at 4 in the morning. Not to an alarm, not to a sound they could immediately identify, but to what they later described as a presence, a change in the quality of the room's atmosphere, a sudden plunge in temperature that had no connection to the actual warmth of the fire, which was still burning. Then the sounds began, fighting in the corner by the fireplace, the clash and grunt of a struggle, They could see shapes in the darkness, shapes that were not quite solid but were not quite not solid either, moving with the frantic purposefulness of men trying to kill each other. The next morning, they told the barman. He reached under the bar and produced a newspaper article. 2 journalists had experienced precisely the same thing in precisely the same room 6 months earlier. The Kingsmill room, named for Thomas Kingsmill himself, the executed leader of the Hawkhurst gang, carries a different kind of haunting. It is a woman, believed to have been the wife or mistress of George Grey, one of the gang's senior members. She does not fight. She does not appear dramatically. She sits. In the rocking chair that used to occupy the corner of the room, she would rock, slowly, steadily, silently, and the room would turn cold, and guests would lie in their beds watching the chair move with no human agency and find that sleep had become impossible. The chair was eventually removed from the inn. It is no longer there. The cold apparently sometimes is. In room 19, named the Hawkhurst room, a man in old-fashioned clothes has been seen sitting at the foot of the bed by multiple guests across multiple decades. He does not speak. He does not move with aggression. He simply sits and watches with the patient, incurious attention of a man who has forgotten that his presence might be alarming, or who has ceased to care. An American guest who encountered him fled the room and spent the remainder of the night wedged between her sons in their room, with a duvet pulled around her head, refusing to return. There is also a maid. She would have been young. Young women in service were almost always young, and her connection to the Hawkhurst gang was the kind of connection that could get a young woman killed in 1740s England. She knew too much. She was the girlfriend of one of the smugglers, and the gang, suspicious of anyone whose knowledge was a potential threat to their operations, killed her. Her ghost is said to move through the inn with the purposeful route of a woman who still has rooms to tend and fires to lay, following the path she walked in life through corridors that have been rebuilt and renamed around her. One employee of the inn quit his job because of an encounter with her. He was tending to the fireplace in one of the rooms, a routine task, the kind of work he had done hundreds of times without incident, when every bottle on the shelf at the other end of the room fell to the floor simultaneously. He did not stay to consider the possibilities. He walked out of the Mermaid Inn and did not go back. The owner of the inn, a woman who bought the building in 1993 and has steered it with care through the decades since, was for a long time the kind of person who listened to her guests' stories with polite skepticism. She had heard too many accounts, she said, to dismiss them entirely, but she had experienced nothing herself that she could not explain. And then a medium visited, and the medium stood in one of the rooms and said that there was a dog present, an old woman with a dog, moving through the space with the confidence of someone who considered themselves still in residence. The owner, standing in the middle of the room, reached out her hand at the medium's direction and felt fur in the middle of the empty air, the texture of an animal that was not there. She no longer describes herself as skeptical. The mermaid's network of bricked-up cellars is still being explored. Work is ongoing to access tunnels that have been sealed for centuries. The owner has mentioned that a police officer is required to be present for the final excavation, because the possibility of discovering human remains in a place with the Mermaid Inn's history is not merely theoretical. The 6th ghost, some staff members say with a slight smile, is still down there, waiting. And then there is the 3rd place, smaller, less celebrated, located in the Surrey countryside at an address that does not appear in most tourism guides. Frimley Hall, a Victorian country house that looks from the outside exactly as a Victorian country house should look, imposing, correct, the kind of building that projects authority and permanence. It was built in the 19th century, furnished for comfort, staffed by a household of servants who moved through its corridors and tended to its rooms, and knew, as servants always know, a great deal more about the family within than the family itself was comfortable acknowledging. Among those servants was a nanny. Her name has not survived. She exists in the history of Frimley Hall only as a function, an occupation, the woman hired to care for the children of the house. She would have lived in the upper floors, in the modest rooms allocated to domestic staff, sleeping between the demands of her employers with the particular exhausted vigilance of someone whose work was never fully finished. She would have known every inch of the house. She would have known the staircases, the grand staircase visible from the entrance hall, and the secondary staircase, the servants' stair, narrow and steep, and built for efficiency rather than elegance. And one day, on one of those staircases, she lost her grip on one of the children. Accounts vary on the details, whether she was carrying the child or holding the child's hand, whether the child slipped or fell or was somehow startled, whether the staircase involved was the main stair or the servants' stair. What the accounts agree on is the outcome. The child died, and the nanny, who had devoted her life to the care and safety of children in her charge, could not survive what she had done or what she had failed to prevent. She never left Frimley Hall. She is reported throughout the building, but most particularly in the upper corridors, in the areas where the children's rooms were located, in the spaces around staircases. She does not appear dramatically. She moves, she watches. She occupies rooms that are now used for other purposes, walking the routes she walked in life with the compulsion of someone who cannot stop, who cannot break the circuit of her guilt, who cannot release herself from the obligation of watching over children who are no longer there. Guests at Frimley Hall have reported waking to find someone standing in the room, someone in the dress of a Victorian servant woman standing very still near the door. Not threatening, not aggressive, simply present, waiting. As if waiting is all that remains of her, all that she knows how to do. There is a quality to the hauntings at Frimley Hall that is different from the Langham and different from the Mermaid Inn. There is no drama in it, no violence echoing down the centuries, no criminal empire, no wedding night murder, only grief. Only the specific, contained, inescapable grief of someone who failed at the thing that mattered most to them and who cannot, or will not, stop trying to make it right. What do we make of these places? These inns and halls where the dead appear to linger, where the past persists with an insistence that outruns explanation. The rational mind reaches for comfortable answers. Infrasound, some researchers suggest, low-frequency sound waves generated by certain architectural configurations, capable of producing unease, visual disturbance, even hallucination in susceptible individuals. Expectation, others argue. We enter buildings with reputations prepared to experience something unusual, and our minds obligingly provide it. The power of suggestion, which should never be underestimated, which can make cold air feel colder and silence feel heavier, and ordinary shadows take on the shapes of things that frighten us. These explanations have merit. They account for some of what is reported at these places, perhaps, but they struggle with the specifics. They struggle with the two guests at the Mermaid who knew nothing of the room's reputation and experienced the duel anyway. They struggle with James Alexander Gordon, who brought his colleague back to room 333 and found the figure still there. They struggle with the owner of the Mermaid who felt fur in an empty room. They struggle with the details that repeat, across witnesses who never communicated, across decades with a consistency that coincidence cannot adequately absorb. England is full of old buildings. Most old buildings are simply old buildings. They creak and settle and produce the sounds of age without producing anything else. But some of them, a small number distributed across the country in no discernible pattern, have taken on something more, something that resists the passage of time with the same stubborn, unreasonable resistance that the dead are supposed to have given up when they ceased to be alive. At the Langham on Portland Place, the corridor of the third floor is quiet tonight. The hotel is full. Guests sleep in rooms whose names carry no weight of history, no particular shadow. But in room 333, in the October darkness, there is a quality to the air that the cleaning staff have learned to move through quickly, without lingering, without turning to look at the corners. The temperature in that room is difficult to regulate. The maintenance team has checked the heating system repeatedly. The system is functioning perfectly. In Rye, on the cobblestoned curve of Mermaid Street, the Elizabethan bedchamber is occupied tonight by guests who researched the inn thoroughly before booking and came prepared, they told the staff at dinner, for anything. They said this with the particular bravado of people who have not yet lain in the dark of that room and heard, from the corner near the fireplace, the first sounds of something beginning. They will see what the morning brings. The barman smiled at them over the bar and said nothing. He has been working here long enough to know what the morning sometimes brings. In Surrey, Frimley Hall stands in its grounds in the quiet of a winter night. There are no children in the upper corridor. There have not been children in those rooms for a very long time, but the nanny, if she is still there, and the accounts suggest she is, does not appear to know that, or does not appear to care. She moves through the darkness with the purposeful unhurry of someone who believes, against all evidence to the contrary, that her watch is not yet over. Perhaps that is the most disturbing thing about these places, not the figures that hover without legs, not the duels that replay for guests who came only for a comfortable bed, not the cold that has no source and the sounds that have no cause, but the persistence, the sheer, exhausting refusal to stop, to accept what happened, to accept what is finished. The Victorian dead are extraordinarily patient. They have, after all, nowhere else to be. And the question that sits in the mind in the last moment before sleep in any old English inn, in the moment when the building has settled into its nighttime sounds, the timber contracting, the old plumbing speaking to itself, the dark, outside the window, absolute and total, is a question about patience, about how long the dead can wait, about whether their patience is infinite, or whether somewhere in the specific dark of a specific room, in the specific cold of a particular October midnight, there is a point at which waiting ends, and something else begins.